Welcome to a new episode of Stratagems. My name is Ruben Ugarte, and today we are looking at the history of the Hudson Bay Company, specifically the Hudson Bay Company that traded furs and that played a significant role in the forming of modern-day Canada and the United States. We're going to see a Hudson Bay Company that will go on to control nearly 3 million square miles of territory, about 12 of the Earth's land surface, in an area 10 times that of the Holy Roman Empire at its height. We're going to see a company that went through 3 distinct strategies during our time period. There's going to be a strategy of harmony in those first 150 years. We're going to see a Hudson Bay Company that tries to undertake a fur trade, makes a lot of money doing it, builds relationships with the First Nations, with the Indigenous tribes of Canada. We're then going to see a Hudson Bay Company that is forced into fierce competition and it has to adopt a strategy of chaos just to keep up. And then we're going to see a Hudson Bay Company that is forced, once again, to take on perhaps a strategy of conquest. When empires, like the British Empire and the American Empire, all of a sudden start to think about their own borders and their own claims to territory. This story will span 200-300 years. The business model is really quite simple. There's furs that you get from beavers who are in abundance at the beginning of the story. And of course, as those beavers are hunted for their furs, they slowly become extinct. Those furs are traded for goods from Europe, metal goods, whether you imagine like metal pans, rifles, and ammunition. But we're going to see so much more. History is this complex story. Stephen Bown, who wrote the fantastic book, The Company, was one of the primary resources for this episode, has this beautiful quote right in the introduction. I want to read that to you. He says, quote, "The Company's history is not a history of heroes and villains, though certainly there were heroic and villainous characters. It is much more nuanced. History is not a single narrative, but rather many competing and intertwining narratives, blending and striking up from each other. In evaluating such a monumental entity and its profound influence on the development of a large portion of North America, the variables are nearly overwhelming. Do we follow the storyline of the uneducated fieldworkers, the aristocrats and financiers in London, the multitude of Indigenous trappers, traders, and entrepreneurs, the predominantly Cree wives of the company's immigrant European workforce, the European fur merchants and hat makers, the famous pathfinders and travelers, the governing overseas directors, or perhaps even the hapless beavers?" And that's what the story is about. Different strands. We're going to try to cover as many of them as possible. Depending on what strand you look at, the story may be good or may be bad, but it is nuanced. And it is a fantastic story. So with that being said, let's jump right into the strategy of harmony. Part 1. A strategy of harmony. To begin our story, before we even get to the Hudson Bay Company and the charter and the furs, we have to look at the Americas and understand what was going on when Columbus landed in 1492. The most generally held anthropological theory based on the latest data is that the indigenous individuals who lived in the Americas, whether North America, Central or South America, came from Asia via the Bering Strait. This was actually first proposed by a Jesuit called Jose de Acosta back in the 1500s, and evidence has piled up in recent years to support this theory. So this means that thousands of years ago, Homo sapiens crossed over from Asia into what today is North America. The Bering Strait was a little bit different. The conditions allowed this crossing to occur. And then over time, individuals will make it all the way down to South America, where at the time of where our story starts, we have empires like the Incas that have been around for thousands of years in some shape or form. In Canada, this also means that the most densely populated area was the Pacific Northwest. It's actually been estimated that at the time of first contact, about half of Canada's total native population was actually living in British Columbia. There were about 30 languages spoken here, and it was really actually one of the most linguistically diverse areas anywhere on Earth. This would be like having, let's say, Chinese spoken on one island, Portuguese on the next, Swahili on the coast, and so on. So this is a very remarkable region. Now, of course, Europeans arrived on the eastern coast initially. Columbus set foot in modern-day Bahamas first. And we're going to see our story really take place closer to the coast of Newfoundland today, whether it's Ontario, Quebec, and so forth. There's an intriguing point that I want to mention here about the native population at the time of arrival. There have been different counts over the years as to how many people actually lived in the Americas, the entire continent, from top to bottom. And even today, the estimates vary. Some of the highest levels, there's estimates that about 112 million people lived in the Americas continent on the eve of European arrival. This is a high count, but again, there's increasing evidence to support that there was a significant number of people living in the Americas. I mean, it's a big continent, so the continent might still feel sparsely populated depending on where you are, but it wasn't empty. And if you do take somewhere in the 100 million number, then it means that the Americas actually had perhaps around a fifth of the world population, and actually more than Europe, which had about 70 million at the time of the first contact. Now, this is important because sometimes there's been a perception, which has been changing recently, that the Americas was simply empty. Here was Europeans who lived in sort of densely populated cities. We think of those incredible city-states like Venice or Rome. But the Americas had a lot of people. Now, it varied, of course, a lot. We can see somewhere in the south, the Inca Empire was quite large. We, of course, have the Mayans and the Aztecs in the Central America, or today, we might call the Aztecs the Triple Alliance, would be the more accurate name. So it was a populated continent with a wide range of tribes and groups with a wide range of languages and customs and traditions. That's really the main point we want to underline here. There was an extensive network of trade that had already been established between the tribes. There's some evidence that perhaps there was some communication all the way from, say, north to south. But there was definitely a very detailed connections between, let's say, the North America tribes, all the way from the Cree to Iroquois, all the way to the Salish coast. They sort of knew of each other. They might have stayed in their territory. For example, the First Nations who lived in the prairies, whether it's today Manitoba and Winnipeg and so on, they may have stuck primarily to the area, hunting buffalo, and develop a culture and traditions around the buffalo. But they were familiar, they knew of, for example, the other First Nations tribes down in the East Coast who perhaps did more fishing or other types of hunting. Of course, beaver hunting, which we're going to see a lot in our story. So the Europeans who came in, they weren't necessarily exploring an empty country on their own, which can sometimes be the perception. In many cases, and really the majority of cases, they were guided by the existing First Nation tribes who introduced them to this pre-existing trade network that had already been created. And we're going to see stories, for example, like Alexander Mackenzie was going to be the first European to go all the way to the Pacific from the East Coast. And he would readily admit, perhaps begrudgingly in some ways, that kind of trip to go from the East Coast to the West Coast of modern-day Canada simply could not be done without Indigenous guides. The Europeans did not have the knowledge necessary of the rivers, of the land, of the weather, but even more importantly, they did not have the connections to be able to trade along the way to be able to survive the journey. There's also, there's interesting notes that by the time Europeans arrived, the knowledge that this was the case started to spread quickly. So all of a sudden, Europeans that may have arrived to what to them seemed like completely new areas, maybe they're in the Hudson Bay itself. But as so happens, the Indigenous who lived there likely had already heard about other European arrivals, let's say other white people arriving somewhere else in the continent, as those trade networks shared messages. And of course, some of the goods themselves, the goods that Europeans would trade, the pots, the metal equipment and guns, those will make their way through these trade networks. And Indigenous would find out that, hey, there's this group of individuals who landed at this part or this other part, and they are bringing these goods to us. If you also go a little bit back in history from where we are today, we're starting somewhere in the late 1400s, let's say 1492, when Columbus arrives. We also have evidence that the Vikings, what we might call today the Norsemen, they also arrived in modern-day Canada about 1000 AD. They didn't quite make it into the mainland itself, but there were remains that have been found in Newfoundland, the island of the mainland of Canada, that have some of this evidence showing of the Vikings' arrival there. So we can even argue that perhaps for some of the First Nations, especially in the East Coast, the Europeans who arrived in 1492 and onwards were not even perhaps the first white men they have seen. There was already precedent, 500 years before with the Vikings that were there for at least a short time. The other thing we want to make a note is if we continue on this high count number, let's say of 100 million, it also kind of puts in perspective the impact that we're going to see from the contact with Europeans. We know that the seas played a major role in what the First Nations and Native Americans and, the Incas and so on went through after Europeans. The Europeans brought over diseases that did not exist in the Americas. And the indigenous individuals were hit quite heavily by this. Now, one example here is we can actually look at Columbus when it landed in central Mexico. And, the central Mexican plateau alone had about 25 million people at the time of Columbus arriving. Again, to put this in contrast, Spain and Portugal together had fewer than 10 million inhabitants. So just to show you the comparison in populations. And there were arguments, too, that actually some of the cities, if you see some of the major cities in the Inca Empire, the Aztecs, some of the conditions and the setup of those cities, where it comes to running water or something else, were actually perhaps a little bit more advanced than the Europeans. Now, this is not a comparison of who's more advanced, who had more. In some ways, they were really drastically different cultures, right? The Europeans had access to things that natives had never seen, whether it's guns or metal equipment or so on. So we can almost see them as two completely different branches of development with some overlap between them. Both of them, of course, figure out agriculture, but there were drastically different things in both of them. But to go back to this example, so the central Mexican plateau at the time of Columbus had about 25 million people. And from the Spanish, it really seemed like this might be perhaps the most, if not one of the most densely populated places on Earth, perhaps even more than China or India at the time. Now, after Cortés, the population of the entire region will collapse. It will collapse for multiple factors. We're going to see these factors over and over again in our story, but, it will collapse because of disease. It will collapse because of infighting. We have evidence that when the Spanish arrived in Peru and they faced the Inca Empire, the empire they faced was actually in decline. It was an empire that had significant infighting, so they did not quite face the apex, the top of the Inca Empire in its history. So the population of the region will collapse, and by 1620 to 1625, right, this is about 130 or 40 years after Cortés has arrived, and of course Cortés and Columbus have arrived in central Mexico, the population was down to about 730,000, or about 3% of the size at the time Columbus landed. And there are estimates that this region did not really recover its 15th century population until about 1960s. So we're going to see this over and over again, right? So first, on the eve of first contact, there's a significant population all over the Americas. The Americas is still pretty big, so depending on where you are, it might feel very densely populated, or it might not, depending on the conditions around it. And then these populations are going to go through significant changes due to disease, due to infighting, due to changes in their traditions, as the relationship with the European arrivals changes, and we're going to see significant declines in populations all over the Americas. And I'm only mentioning this because this contact with Europeans could mean, at even a more conservative level, that a portion of the world population would sort of disappear over about 100 years after this moment, right? So if the Americas may have about 100 million or about a fifth of the world population, and perhaps we're going to see 50, 60% of it perish through multiple factors, we're talking about sort of significant numbers, right? And this also makes sense because we're, at the moment when the Hudson Bay Company, for example, goes inland, we're going to see this in our story, part of the reason why they're going inland is because the population is declining. And some of the trade networks that were established are starting to break and disintegrate 100, 150 years after European arrival because the population itself is actually declining quite rapidly on the First Nation side. Now, I'm not here to say that Europeans are responsible for this death. We have to realize that the theory of germs that we have today, when we see someone with a cold or with the flu, and we have a general instinct to say, hey, that person is sick, they're infectious, they need to go home and rest and avoid contact. This theory did not become prevalent until about the mid-18th century. And to Europeans themselves, they were also confused by how some diseases worked, right? So perhaps they could recognize the symptoms of chickenpox or smallpox, but they did not know how to treat it. They did not know how to deal with it or how to prevent it. This simply did not exist. So they were unknowingly carrying diseases that they just simply did not fully understand in the same level. And of course, when these diseases will hit the First Nations populations all over the Americas, they will also be equally as surprised, equally as frustrated by how random it seems. It kind of seems like some people will get sick and recover, other people will get sick and die. We see stories, for example, in the North America portion that the disease would affect some tribes, but not others, even though the tribes were close to each other. They would affect tribes that actually never had any direct contact with Europeans. Again, to us today, we can see as like we can hear them and be like, oh yeah, that's just how germs spread. That's how viruses can spread. That makes complete logical sense. But at this point in time, it just really wasn't understood well. And if you look at Europe itself, as it dealt with its own diseases, if we look at, say, the Black Death, right, which is the bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Europe between maybe 1346 to 1353, this is considered one of the most fatal pandemics in human history, with perhaps as many as 50 million people dying from it, which was perhaps around 50% of the Europeans' 14th century population. So Europeans themselves have faced their own diseases and their own sort of unknowns as to, how is it possible that this bubonic plague spreads? How do people survive it? What do you do? And generally, there's really not a lot of answers. It's just you hope and you pray that you're not going to contract it, or if you do, you're going to recover. So the things that the First Nations will go through in the 1500s and the 1600s and 1700s, really in particular, are things that Europeans and other populations went through as they dealt with their own plagues and their own diseases without really concrete answers. Now, let's look at some of the population density in North America in particular, Canada and the upper parts of the US. We can see in the Pacific slope, the Pacific Northwestern area, there were perhaps somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 Indigenous individuals. Around the Eastern Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Valley, there was another 100,000 to 150,000. And in the Western Interior, there were another 50,000 to 100,000. And then perhaps fewer than 100,000 lived elsewhere. So in total, this means that perhaps slightly more than 500,000 people occupied the land of what today is modern-day Canada when the Europeans arrived. And if you actually look at the Canadian map today, Canada today has about 40 million people at the time of this recording. We can see that actually this population of Canada is heavily concentrated near the border with the US in the major cities like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and so forth. So even on a modern basis, the Canadian country is sparsely populated when you look at sort of how big it is and so on. So we see some similar patterns here with the First Nations. Now, the First Nations individuals also figure out agriculture. Agriculture has developed independently all over the world within the span of a few thousand years. So it didn't spread from a single place to the rest of the world. Just different cultures sort of figure out on their own that you could grow things. And depending on where you lived, you grow different vegetables and fruits. So this 500,000 individuals that Europeans are about to come in contact with, particularly the French and the British, are really very rich, diversified group of cultures. And there's some remarkable achievements that were done. For example, the First Nations actually developed corn, which is one of the world's most efficient and versatile crops. They will develop tomatoes, which today is actually a basic ingredient to Italian cuisine. There's peppers, essential to Thai and Indian cuisine. All of the world's squashes, except for a couple that were domesticated in the US, many of the beans on their dinner plates. We also see, for example, potatoes, which came from South America, from the Incas, which became a major driver in some European countries like Ireland. And there's been some estimates that perhaps about 3/5 of the crops now in cultivation were actually developed somewhere in Mesoamerica. Now, these cultures had traditions, of course, that they had developed over those hundreds and thousands of years. One in particular that I think is helpful, because we're going to see it over and over again, is gift giving. So diplomacy and trade were typically intertwined for many of the First Nations tribes. And gift giving was one of the ways in which they made both of them happen. Different leaders from different nations would meet, and they would present gifts to each other depending on what were some of the expertise they had. And they were sort of symbolic gestures of goodwill. And the exchange was often a lengthy affair, right? It wasn't just 1 hour. It was perhaps multiple days with different elements. There were food, there were speeches, there was a ritual smoking, which is this sort of, they were typically smoking a variation of the tobacco pipe. So we're going to see the Hudson Bay Company in particular adopt this. So they see it, they recognize the value of it, and they're going to become part of the gift-giving ceremonies that many of the First Nations had developed before the Europeans arrived. Now, of course, our story really centers on the beaver. The fur of the beaver is going to become this central item for both Europeans and eventually the Indigenous themselves. Now, the Indigenous tribes had been hunting beaver for hundreds of thousands of years. Not all of them, but some of them were. So let's look a little bit at the beaver and why the beaver is so special. The beaver. Now, beavers have been around for a very long time. There's actually prehistoric beavers that were the size of grizzly bears that really roamed through Asia, Europe, and North America during the last great ice age. And this giant beavers, you can actually find photos online if you want, because it's incredible. Maybe a little bit scary. Today beavers are mostly pretty cute, right? They're kind of small, maybe half the size of like a regular dog, like a golden retriever. But they used to be quite big. And this ancestors of today's beavers, of course, they disappear when the glaciers of the last ice age melted, and there was this vast flooding, and we are left with this smaller version beavers that we see today. Now, in North America, the beaver dams and the ponds and the waterworks, they were actually quite essential to establishing many of the water systems that created the rich biodiversity of the continent. So North America was really what one book has described as sort of beaver land. There were perhaps as many as 400 million beavers in the continent before Europeans arrived. Beavers also existed elsewhere, right? We see them in Asia, we see them in Europe. In the Asian Middle East, for example, the beaver castor, this kind of oil that the beavers secrete, tended to be used for medicinal purposes. In Iran, beavers were called water dogs, and they were typically considered sacred and protected by a system of fines. Harming a beaver in ancient Persia could cost you 60,000 darics. And what happened is the beaver has several elements that are quite appealing to humans. First is, of course, the fur. The fur is waterproof, and in an age before Gore-Tex, it's highly valuable. That fur can be converted into many things, such as hats or pelts or coats. So many of the beaver populations would eventually go extinct. This is something called to be beaver out. But in Europe in particular, whatever beaver populations existed in Europe or Asia and so on, as societies realized the value of beavers, they would be hunted and they would be driven to extinction. So when the Europeans arrive in North America, they all of a sudden see, of course, the First Nations were in the beaver coast, and then they can see the beavers. Keep in mind, this is a time where if you have hundreds of millions of beavers, you're seeing them all the time. They're not hidden. So this became instantly very attractive to Europeans. Now, the First Nations themselves have, of course, hunted the beavers for hundreds or thousands of years before Europeans. And they typically hunted the beavers with spears. They destroyed their lodges. They sort of killed them as they tried to flee. They would eat their flesh and use their fur. But generally, First Nations had a kind of very specific relationship with beavers. Their culture had taboos against hunting beavers for fun. They Beavers could be used to create the furs that many First Nations used throughout the winters, but they were never to be hunted towards extinction. And many of the First Nations actually had rituals that would honor the beaver even after death. So we see some level of harmony here between the existing First Nations and the beaver population. Some writers even estimate that really in the North American continent, you really had two groups of individuals living there. You had the humans, we see somewhere of perhaps 500,000 individuals, and of course the beavers themselves. Besides the fur, there's other elements of the beaver that are highly coveted. Some are kind of intriguing. One is actually the tail of the beaver. In medieval Europe, fried beaver tail was called forest cod, and it appeared quite regularly on the sort of banquet tables of the wealthy and the aristocracy. Now, in Germany, it was actually so valuable that it was typically only reserved for the emperor himself. Beaver tends to be quite rich and fatty, so it kind of makes it this kind of delicious delicacy if you have access to it. And as an intriguing theological point, because beavers spend so much time in water, as they build their dams and they swim around them, the Catholic Church actually consider beaver meat to be quote-unquote cold like fish. The church, at the time, less so today, typically forbade the eating of any hot meats during times of absences and atonement. But cold foods like fish and beaver were allowed. So this kind of loophole meant that for many individuals, if they wanted to have some kind of hot meat that wasn't fish, beaver was a fantastic alternative that was approved by the Catholic Church. Now, beavers themselves are quite particular. They are considered to be behaviorally weird, which just simply means that no one really knows when they started building dams. They don't really understand how much intelligence the beavers have compared to just instinct. That is, do they build dams because it's genetically in their bodies, or because they have some level of intelligence that tells them if you build dams, you're going to be able to stop the water and create homes and that kind of stuff. The beavers of today, of course, their eyes and ears and nose are aligned, so they actually swim like alligators. Their head is typically barely visible. The body is submerged in the water, but they don't do it to hunt, but really to avoid becoming prey. The beavers are more fragile than perhaps other animals. The beavers cannot see well, and their primary sense is smell. So a beaver will use its nose to locate the cinnamon smell of birch, of the tree that they love to eat and take down. And what beavers can do together is really quite amazing. When 3 or 4 of them work together, they can roll a 100-pound boulder and set it in their dam. And they can fell a 5-inch willow in about 6 minutes. They sort of willow down the trunk like this enormous sharpened pencil, and then they can haul those pieces of tree to then build their dams. Beavers are considered a keystone species, which means that it's an organism that's so critical to the survival of a biological community that they sort of hold the community together. And the dams that they create, they'll typically flood areas. So they'll create all these opportunities for other species, whether plants or other animals, to live. So really, for better or worse, beavers, like humans, they have a really high impact on their environment. They use tools, but like humans, they can dramatically alter the landscape to kind of create the environment they want or need. Now, the fur, which is really the central point of a story, typically has 2 layers. It has an outer layer of this water-resistant guard hairs. You can kind of think of them like long hairs, like you might find on a dog, that like a golden retriever or something like that. That you have long strands of hair, and then there's an underlayer of very short, tightly packed fur. Now, the outer hairs are so thick that even a postage stamp-sized bit of fur contains more than 100,000 individual strands. This is more hair than any of us have on our own heads. And the underlayer, which is typically called beaver wool, is made up this short hairs that are sort of serrated with a tiny barb, so they interlock. So the underlayer, this beaver wool, tends to feel very thick to your hand. There's actually a couple of videos online where you can see someone separate them. And it's this underlayer in particular that was highly coveted in Europe and specifically hat makers. They realized that you can take this beaver wool and combine it perhaps with other types of wool, and you can compress it to produce this superlative felt that was quite soft and quite durable. Now, of course, this realization happened before Europeans arrived in North America, right? The beaver populations that existed, particularly in Russia, they were completely eradicated. And when this happened, actually, there was almost like a mythology of the soft beaver fur that lived on in the history of Europe until all of a sudden North America appears with this nearly infinite supply of beavers. The beaver wool provided warmth in really harsh conditions, right? Today we may have something like Gore-Tex. Back then, this was the way to keep warm and to keep dry. And First Nations have already figured this out on their own, and they had created their own coats out of the beaver wool that they would wear throughout the winter. And as they wore these coats, the guard hairs, the outer layer, would actually fall off. They would be rubbed off. So you can imagine they would sort of hunt the beaver. They would create this coat out of it with both the outer layer and the underlayer, the guard hairs and the beaver wool respectively. They would wear that coat all throughout winter, and then the guard hairs would slowly fall off, and that would just leave the beaver wool, which was the more luxurious, soft part of the beaver. Now, there was also a production quirk that we may see here. Europeans at the time, at least the European felt makers that resided primarily in France and then Britain, they actually had not yet developed an industrial process to extract the unwanted guard hairs from the beaver wool, the underlayer. The Russians had actually perfected a process for doing it, but they refused to share their, quote-unquote technological secret with Europeans. Because this meant that for many of the European filmmakers, they had to send whatever beaver coats they had to the Russians. They would take them through this secret process to remove the guard hairs, and they would send back the beaver wool back to the felt makers. The indigenous peoples in Canada offer an intriguing solution to all of this. We know that they would wear the coats over the winter, and then the guard hairs will fall off, and then you would be left with only the beaver wool. So it turns out that when Europeans started to trade, and they had, metal pots and guns and stuff like that, what they really wanted was not fresh beaver coats, but they wanted the used winter coats that the First Nations had already worn either for one winter or 2 winters or 3 winters, whatever it was, because those coats had no guard hairs, right? They have already been stripped off. So from the perspective of the First Nations, this was incredibly weird. Here were this group of individuals, they're giving out highly useful things. To the First Nations, the metal pots, the guns, and so on were highly useful. But they wanted something that, from their perspective, was actually not useful at all. They were going to discard these used fur coats because they had already worn them for a winter or two. They didn't need them. So there was this dynamic initially between the First Nation and the Europeans where they thought, well, you want our used winter coats? Are you going to give us this very useful things? Sure. Now, you typically needed many beaver pelts to make even just a single hat, perhaps maybe 3 to 4 beaver pelts. This meant that many of the hats were actually quite pricey. They were carefully tended to and repaired for years, and then sometimes even passed down as some kind of inheritance for individuals. It initially started as something that was only done by wealthy individuals in Europe as a sign of status. Eventually, like anything else, there was simply so much supply of beaver felt and then so much supply of the actual final hats or coats that this would go down to every strata in European society, and it would become less of a luxury item or maybe less of an exclusive luxury item. You might perhaps think about it like Gucci today, where Gucci is luxury, but it's also sort of accessible luxury, right? If you have the money, you can buy it. And there's many items today of different price ranges. Something else that also ties to the story is that many of the felt and hat manufacturing individuals, the experts, they were typically residing in France for most of the history leading up to the first contact. They were typically Protestants. We saw a little bit of the Protestant Reformation in the McKinsey episode. But in the mid-1680s, they began to flee their homes due to religious persecution, and they actually crossed the English Channel, where around this time, all of a sudden, the Hudson Bay will become a thing, right? The Hudson Bay will be established in 1670. So about 10, 20 years after that corporation is established, all of a sudden you have this concentration of felt and hat manufacturing expertise that's fleeing France and is joining Britain. And now there's even more incentive for the British Empire to sort of figure out how to make this whole beaver trade work on a high scale. Now let's take a look at what the fur trade business looked like in the beginning, from the moment the Europeans arrived, and then we'll look at the Hudson Bay Company as it gets established officially by the British Empire. The first European country to start trading furs was, of course, the French. They established centers for trading. This will become cities. We see, for example, the founding of Quebec, which happened in 1608. And it helped mark a transition from just a seasonal coast trade to perhaps a more permanent enterprise with deeper routes into the interior. And during this initial, let's say, 100 years from European arrival, the First Nations were really affluent societies. They had access to, of course, lots of resources, whether the beavers or the fish or the turkeys or the buffalo. But then there was the first 100 years, the Europeans offer trade items that did not exist in the continent. They were able to trade away the furs, which existed in abundance, of course, from the beavers. And those initial trade networks that have been developed over hundreds of years, they were simply just strengthened through the introduction of European goods. Many of the First Nations, of course, served roles as middlemen. The Europeans initially, we're going to see them for the first maybe couple hundred years. They're really not going to venture inland. So they're going to stay close to the coast, whether it's in Quebec or we're eventually going to see the Hudson Bay Company kind of stick around to the bay itself, because venturing inland was not easy, right? You needed guides. You perhaps didn't know the terrain or the weather. And besides, there were middlemen, First Nation tribes who would bring the goods to you. They would bring the furs and they would take back the metal goods or whatever it is. So there was really no need to go inland. You could just create your little outposts of trade, and perhaps the population of those outposts will grow over time, but no real need to go beyond that into what is a highly treacherous environment. Now in 1665, we're about 150 years from first contact, there are two French individuals, two corps de bois, as we would call them, voyagers, who are part of the fur trade in a small basis, individually, but they believe that there could be something bigger here, right? That perhaps there could be something that could be more established, perhaps more in line with the French Empire. They were French. Something that could have a bigger scale. So they pitched the idea to the French government. The French government doesn't want it. They then pitched the idea to the 13 colonies, which at this time is still, an extension, a colony of the British Empire. And the 13 colonies doesn't want it either. So then they go and they sort of pitch the idea in Britain. So they sail across the ocean and they go talk to the British government, in effect, to kind of pitch this idea. Now, the basic idea for them that they pitched to the British was, hey, you as an empire founded the English East India Company in 1600. And this East India Company is responsible for trade between India and the British Empire, primarily around tea. So why don't you take that same concept that seems to be working really well, and it really was, right? It was a profitable endeavor that the British were running with India. Why don't we take the same idea but apply it to North America and specifically to furs? So that's really the fundamental pitch that's being done here, right? So the two individuals, last name Radisson and Groseillers, my bad for any French pronunciation, they pointed out that this, East India Company is doing fantastic. It's showing great profits with its monopoly trade to India. And, it was at the time dispatching about 30 ships around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Perhaps the Hudson Bay could receive a similar treatment. After all, actually, the Hudson Bay was actually first explored by an English mariner, even though the French are the primary presence in what today is Canada. English had been there in some shape or form. We have to remember that for many of the European explorers who were arriving in the Americas, they were, of course, excited to kind of find some kind of route into India, China, and Japan, and of course, the Spice Islands. So for many Europeans, they were still looking for this. They still thought there might be some kind of northwestern passage through the Hudson Bay that would take you into this coveted spice lands. No one had really found it. And of course, once you go through a mapping process, which we're going to see with Alexander Mackenzie later on, we realize there's actually no real passage into the spice lands, not in the way Europeans thought about it. But nonetheless, this was still top of mind for many individuals in the British Empire and the French Empire. Can there be really a passage that Columbus originally sort of sought out before he stumbled into the Americas? Now, the pitch to the British Empire goes well. They liked it. So there's a new British company that gets created that has the highly optimistic and very long name, which seems to be very common of the era. The Company of the Merchants of London, Discoveries of the Northwest Passage. Even the name itself tells you that to the British Empire, they heard, oh, we can have a trade on first, and they think, okay, that might be interesting. Perhaps we can do something. But if you can find this Northwest Passage to to India and to spices that may be more convenient than what we have right now, that might be worth it. So even in the name itself, there's still this optimism that this passage exists. And we're going to see that the Hudson Bay will be given a monopoly to trade furs, but one of the non-fur trading responsibilities is to sort of keep looking for this passage. It's not quite clear if it exists, but keep looking for it. Maybe you'll find it, and maybe this whole thing might be worth it from that perspective. Now, for the British aristocrats, they view North America, and really sort of the northern part of North America, modern-day Canada, much like the Romans sort of viewed the Celtic tribes of Britain. They sort of saw the First Nations, the Indigenous people, as relatively harmless people with primitive technology compared to to themselves. And they didn't really know much about the Indigenous traditions, who they were, their cultures. They didn't care very much, but they thought there might be some advantages here to create a commercial enterprise. This is an intriguing notion here, because we're going to make the distinctions between what's going to happen here in North America with the Hudson Bay Company and what's going to happen down south, or more south towards the Caribbean with the sugar trade. So we'll come back to it in a second. But this is the general perception. We're not really sure what's going on there. We don't really know these people. They seem kind of primitive, but there might be some commercial benefits to doing trade. So let's explore that. Now, the Hudson Bay, if you actually look at it on the map today, is this enormous inland sea that seems that perhaps was created by this ancient meteorite, of course, millions of years before. The bay is connected to the Atlantic Ocean by a single inlet through the Hudson Strait. This is a 750-kilometer long and 150-kilometer wide waterway. It's typically known for very turbulent and erratic currents. And there's ice chunks for a good part of the year, which makes it quite difficult for sailing ships to arrive into it and, of course, to depart. The bay is actually colder and icier than the Arctic Ocean, despite being much farther south, because its isolation from moderating currents keeps it quite cold. So the Hudson Bay, it's accessible to ships, but only during some months of the year. So we're going to see that the Hudson Bay is going to get into some kind of cadence here, some frequency where they might collect furs in the spring. This might be a multi-month process. Somewhere in the summer, August or September, the ships will arrive from Britain with goods. They would trade those goods to the First Nations. They would put the furs on the ship, and the ship would then depart before winter sets in, because if they depart too late, they're not going to be able to leave the bay. It's going to be frozen and have too many ice chunks. Now, after delaying for several months, on May 2nd, 1670, Charles II, the current king of the time, he granted a charter to his cousin, Prince Rupert, and 17 fellow courtier adventurers. He gave them a charter that gave them the right to be the sole trade and commerce of the Hudson Bay as the, quote, true and absolute lords and proprietors of the region, that included all of the seas, straits, bay, rivers, lakes, creeks, and sounds in whatsoever latitude they shall be that lie with the entrance of the straits commonly called Hudson Straits together with all the lands, countries, and territories upon the coast and confines of the seas aforesaid. The charter was actually quite long. It's actually about 7,000 words long. But this is a big charter. You kind of have to see it on the map to kind of get the scale of it. Charles II has sort of granted his friends, some might argue perhaps his cronies, this grandiose monopoly that was absurd in its scope and geographical undertaking. It was absolute mercantile British law over a territory that encompassed the entire sort of watershed of the Hudson Bay. This is about 4 million square kilometers. In modern day terms, the charter spanned about 40% of modern day Canada. It included northern Ontario and Quebec, all of Manitoba, southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, and a good portion of the states of North Dakota and Minnesota. Now, because very few people had actually been here, they kind of understood this. It actually took generations before they had any idea as to what the grant actually entailed, how large it was. The king, of course, would then go to appoint his cousin Rupert, who was part of that group of 17, 18 individuals, to be the first governor of the Company of Adventurers of England trading into the Hudson Bay. And the governor was to be assisted by a committee of 7 well-connected gentlemen. So the individuals who are given a grant here, who are given this charter for the Hudson Bay Company, are aristocrats. They are rich individuals connected with the crown. They have some relation to Charles or his cousin Rupert. And they are given this monopoly to trade in this vast area around the Hudson Bay. It was primarily focused on trading, on doing business. But as we mentioned before, it did have some minor obligations, such as trying to continue to find this northwest passage to the Spice Islands in Asia. It also should probably think about establishing permanent commercial outposts that may be advantageous to the British Empire in the future. But we have to understand that at this point in time, and really for the first 150 years, the Hudson Bay Company, as it would be known very soon, really was not an extension of the British Empire in the sense that they were there to conduct business, but they had no colonization efforts. They weren't there to convert the First Nations to Christianity. They were not there to expand the boundaries of the British Empire. There were some language around it, but it was not a major priority, and it will not be seen at all by a priority by people on the ground for the first 150 years. So they were not there to convert the First Nations to anything, whether religion or culture or something. They were not there to spread the cultural values of the British Empire. Not yet. Now, this corporation is going to be very small. It would really seldom employ more than 500 workers throughout its history. It's going to go a little bit larger later on in our story. And it will be governed by this well-connected English aristocrats, perhaps maybe around a dozen of them. And there will be a very clear difference between the committee back in London and the individuals on the ground. From the committee's perspective, they were really primarily focused on the business, on profit. And as long as the Hudson Bay was able to successfully deliver furs with minimal issues, the London Committee was happy, right? They were not traveling themselves to the Hudson Bay. They were not going to the Americas and North America to see what's going on. They were just seeing the ships come in or the ships depart with goods. And as long as that made sense, the London Committee was happy. So the people on the ground, they had to make their own decisions to align with this goal of profit, of running the business. And they made some very interesting decisions. And I want to highlight them because they're going to be quite different from the Hudson Bay that we're going to see a little later on. So the people on the ground, the individuals who are going to live in the Hudson Bay, they're going to build forts, outposts to make this trade happen. They're really going to stick primarily to the Hudson Bay itself. And they're really only going to have a few forts being built here. This forts will be somewhat primitive. This is not luxurious buildings of sort. They're quite basic, just enough to be able to survive the harsh winter and be able to conduct the fur trade. They're not really going to go inland, not for the first 150 years anyway. They're going to wait for the First Nations to canoe to them and the forts that are basically, at the edge of the bay itself. And they actually would oppose or even admit any Europeans other than its employees from traveling its domain, which, again, just to reinforce that, even though the charter is quite large, Hudson Bay Company's employees are not really going to travel this charter for the bulk of the 150 years, but they're not going to allow any European to go in it nonetheless. The guidelines that were adopted by the people on the ground also forbade the company from any activity that would inflame relations between the English and the Indigenous people. This meant that for its employees, they were not to be involved with any of the long-standing arguments or issues that the Indigenous people had among themselves. As we imagine, we have different tribes with hundreds and thousands of years of history. They were sometimes at war with each other. They had impasses, but the company employees, the Hudson Bay Company employees, are not going to intervene, right? Their perspective is, hey, we're here to trade. You guys figure out your relationships. As long as the trade happens, as long as we were able to trade our metal goods for the furs, we're happy. We're not here to be arbitrators. We're not here to impose British law on what you do. You do you. If someone somehow asked the Hudson Bay Company employees for religion, for example, for teachings on Christianity, they were to be given, but it seems like, apart from a single priest who was dispatched for a few years in the 1680s, there really was never any big focus on this. Again, they were not running seminars to convert the First Nations into Christianity. The company was focused on business. Business was business. They wanted to make money, and they were going to make all the decisions around that. Now, there was actually a note in their charter that they were specifically not to make war with any other Christian nation or monarch, which, if we're being honest, this meant that they were not to make war with any European, and more specifically, the French, since there were no other European monarchs in the region. Now, the people on the ground also would adopt the gift-giving ceremony that we saw before. So they would look at many of the traditions the First Nations had, and they would adopt them as much as possible. So they thought, hey, if the First Nations use gift-giving as a way to conduct business, we're going to do that. If they use marriage as a way to strengthen relationships and for diplomacy, we're going to do that. If they don't trade in a specific way, we're going to follow that. So this is the position on the ground. Again, the London Company perhaps may have been in disagreement. Perhaps maybe they had other ideas, but generally they were not going to impose them, right? They were not going to travel themselves. And the business was generating profit, so everything was good. So we're seeing actually a strategy of harmony, right? We're seeing the Hudson Bay Company employees, the very small number at this time, there's maybe fewer than 100. They want to be harmonious with the First Nations around them, conduct trade in a way that makes sense based on the perspective of the First Nations, and avoid any kind of disruption possible, even the kind of disruption that might arise by Hudson Bay Company employees traveling inland. So they are highly conservative, might be the way to describe it here. There's no grander mission yet for the Hudson Bay Company. It's really all about business, and whatever will make business easier is the correct policy. Now, the region that the Hudson Bay Charter encompassed was quite valuable, as you can imagine. There was perhaps between 10 and 20 million beavers in this region, and perhaps up to about 100 million beavers throughout North America, perhaps higher, depending on some of the estimates you look at. The charter also contained about half of the world's supply of fresh water. And the region itself was actually quite swampy, full of lakes and ponds. It was covered in aspen and birch, two tree types that beavers love. So there was really quite an amazing habitat for beavers, perhaps one of the best habitats in the planet for beavers, and this was covered by the charter itself. Now, the position of the forts that the Hudson Bay Company will initially build, of course, were also quite advantageous. They were built at the bay itself, where the ships would arrive from Europe and then leave to go back to Europe. And despite the difficulties of this Hudson Strait during the winter, without the ice, it was quite convenient for ships to come in and go out. We're going to see some difficulty with the French traders, for example, which have to trade from a different part of the East Coast. So the Hudson Bay overall was a great location for this fur trade business. And the way the individuals were conducting business made it even more advantageous. Now, several First Nations tribes will become the middlemen. The Cree are one of the most well-known, which means that even people who lived far away from the Hudson Bay itself, they could trade their used pelts, give them to other First Nations, and they would conduct the canoe trips to the Hudson Bay and then bring back the mellow goods. We got to keep in mind that these trips were actually not easy. Perhaps individuals would travel for weeks on canoe. They may need to get out of the rivers to avoid rapids or waterfalls and then carry the canoes over ground. So this would typically a multi-week trip by the First Nations. So naturally, any First Nations, any Indigenous tribes that did not have expertise with canoes, you can imagine that some of the Indigenous tribes in the prairies who perhaps did not have a need for canoes were wary about conducting these trips on their own. So they would much rather just simply give the furs to a middleman, and the middleman takes them and then brings back the mellow goods. Now, for the middleman themselves, this will become quite profitable because now you're sort of making that profit in between the service, a very classic sort of economic concept we have today. But the middlemen were also susceptible, right? We're going to see that Hudson Bay companies will see this, and then they might start to realize, you know what, maybe we should go around the middleman and kind of go to the people themselves. So maybe build forts inland, which we're going to see this, not in the first 150 years, but eventually the Hudson Bay Company, especially due to the competition we'll see in the next section, they'll be highly motivated to leave their little nests around the Hudson Bay and go inland with their own forts and their own canoes and their own trips. So the middlemen are a temporary part of this process. But for 100 years, 150 years, maybe 200 years, it could be highly profitable for the First Nations who became the middlemen. Now, the First Nations tribes, the Indigenous tribes, quickly learned the value of these European goods. We see, of course, metal hatchets, knife blades, projectile points, firearms, ammunitions, which will alter the balance of the military, right? Remember that there's long-standing wars and disagreements between many of the First Nations tribes. So any tribe that's able to acquire, let's say, metal hatchets or knife blades could get an advantage in war. Eventually, these weapons will disperse among everybody, so that advantage will disappear. But you might have an advantage over 20, 30, 40, 50 years before someone else acquires them. Outside of war, there were some goods that were just simply highly useful. We see, for example, brass and copper kettles, which had a dramatic impact on domestic life. Before the introduction of these items, many of the First Nations individuals would cook food in containers made from bark, hide, or paunches. And typically the vessels, could not be placed over an open flame. They might melt, or they might have to be discarded after one use. So metal pots would become very handy as a way to simmer food unattended for hours over the fire. You can imagine today your use of metal pots and what would happen if you didn't have metal pots. There were other items, perhaps some more fashionable items that also became popular as trade goods, but it generally boiled down to the sort of pragmatic metal goods that would help in cooking or in war or something like that. Now, from the perspective of the First Nations, they really didn't care who was in charge at the forts, right? They were really more frustrated with any kind of trade disruption. If they were going to conduct or embark on a week-long trip, they didn't want to arrive at a fort and not be able to get the goods they wanted. So any kind of lack of consistency or availability of goods was the most frustrating for the First Nations during this portion of our story. If they wanted metal goods, they were expecting it after traveling for 3-4 weeks. And if for some reason the company was disrupted, let's say a ship was not able to arrive that year from Europe, they may not have enough goods to satisfy the demands of the First Nations who made those trips. At the same time, after embarking on this multi-week-long trip, they were not simply going to arrive and then leave right away, right? The sort of gift-giving ceremony becomes a big element here. They're going to engage in this multi-day affair with the Hudson Bay Company employees. There's the smoking and the feasts and the speeches. This is all part of the endeavor that's going on. And again, from the perspective of the Hudson Bay Companies, they were ready for it, right? They knew that the First Nations middlemen in particular would arrive at a certain point in time during the year. They were going to stay for several days or perhaps a couple weeks. There's this whole ceremonial aspect to the trade, and then they would then go back. They would ship the goods to Europe, and then they would wait the winter and then repeat it over and over again. It's also important to highlight that marriages became very common at this time. Again, from the perspective of the Hudson Bay Company employees on the ground, marriages were just simply another element that made sense to make business happen, right? And, you can imagine for the individuals who perhaps lived in the Hudson Bay area for many years, marriages to locals, to the First Nations, also made pragmatic sense. So from this point on, in the history, over the next 100, 230 years, you're going to have more and more of what we call sort of mixed children, right? Children who have European parents and also First Nation parents. Some of these individuals will go by different names. Perhaps they might be called country-born or citizens of the Bay. The French will actually call them métis or by different names. But we're going to see this group of individuals grow with time and also go through different challenges, right? Just the challenges of being mixed race in a world that is going to change quite dramatically, right? The relationship so far is harmonious between the 100, 200 local employees that live on the Bay itself and the hundreds of thousands of First Nations individuals. But that harmony is going to break down eventually. And one of the reasons why this harmony will change is that disease will start to play a role, right? So we're going to see endless waves of epidemics just affecting many different First Nation tribes all over the continent, even individuals who didn't meet or didn't actually travel to the Bay itself. And this depopulation by epidemic will be one of the factors that will promote the Hudson Bay Company from going inland. It would wake them up from their sort of quiet monopoly on the Bay to say, you know what, I think we have to go inland. If we want to grow this trade, if we want to continue doing trade, we have to change our approach. At the same time, after 100, 150 years, for some people, especially in London and elsewhere, they start to wonder, why should this small company that's sort of governed by a dozen aristocrats, why should they get such a vast charter of unknown extent? At this point in time, we still don't have a full map of North America. But why should they get all of this if they're simply just going to huddle around the Bay and wait for the First Nations to come to them? So this question now starts to become a little bit more top of mind for some individuals. And this is where the strategies will change. We're going to go into a strategy of chaos. And that strategy will be driven by disease, but also by a new competitor, the Nor'westers. And the French, who started the fur trade, will come back into the picture. So let's jump in to part 2, a strategy of chaos. Part 2, a strategy of chaos. So to understand how the Hudson Bay Company went from this quiet, highly profitable monopoly in the Hudson Bay, we have to look at what's going on in the rest of what today we might call modern-day Canada. Now, Canada, the word itself has many meanings, or at least many potential meanings. One is, of course, a word called Kanata, which means our village. But you have also seen Kanata being translated as a collection of houses, to village dwellers, to yonder beer wigwams. So there's lots of sort of definitions for what this native word Kanatas could mean. But generally, we associate with Canada as the name of the country. Now, there's other words today that also, of course, go back to language from the First Nations. Quebec kind of means where the river narrows. Nova Scotia means New Scotland. Newfoundland, of course, means Newfoundland. It's helpful to remember that there was settlements that were growing in size even before the Hudson Bay Company charter was created. We saw Quebec being founded in 1608. Then we have Montreal, founded in 1642. And of course, the French have a heavy presence in the region throughout all this time. Now we're going to see the French go to war with the British multiple times and in sort of multiple parts of the world. In particular, it's helpful to see the French and Indian War, where Quebec, or at least the forces in Quebec, were defeated by the British forces in 1759 to 1760. This French and Indian War, as it's called, is typically part of the larger 7 Years' War that's going on in Europe. But this defeat of the French in Quebec in 1760 is particularly important to us because it sort of ends the French colonies in North America. It's at this point in time where the French leaves the colonies and they become either their own thing or they become more closely associated with the British. Today, of course, we kind of still see remnants of that distinction. We see a province like Quebec that has a very strong French culture because, that French culture grew over almost 200 years before it became part of a larger sort of British culture that we see around it. So this is kind of where we're picking up this strategy of chaos here. We see the founding in 1670 of the Hudson Bay Company, and now we are about 100 years after that with the defeat of the French Empire and then their departure from Canada from the perspective of the colonies. Now, the French voyageurs, the Corps de Bois, as they've been called, they were really quite instrumental in the exploration of Canada. It's been said that Canada has really been explored and exploited largely by river. It was a nation born of the canoe. And this French paddlers, these voyageurs are quite instrumental in this whole process right now. The individuals who were paddling these canoes, and there were more than one, perhaps, but somewhere between 6 and 8 who were paddling these canoes. They would paddle from before dawn into dark without rest, 12 hours a day in the northern summer. And they will, of course, require this sort of staggering amount of calories to make these journeys possible. And there's actually some specific numbers, where some of the voyagers might need perhaps up to 9 pounds of meat per day for each voyager. So the logistics of food is going to become essential as individuals are going to want to explore the rest of the Canadian country, the rest of North America, primarily by canoe. Let me read you here a quick description of a person who was a voyager, who loved this life. He says, quote, "I have been 25 years a canoeman and 41 years in service. No portage was ever too long." This is just strip. "For me, 50 songs I could sing. I have saved lives of 10 voyagers, have had 12 wives and 6 running dogs. I spend all my money in pleasure. Were I young again, I should spend my life the same way over. There's no life so happy as voyager life." Now, for many of the Canadians, and at this point in time, Canadian typically means you're born in this settlements around the Quebec, Montreal area, and eventually we're going to see some of the Ontario region. The founding of Canada as a country is still a few years away, well, perhaps more than 100 years away. But for Canadians, which are, again, at this point kind of seen more as the individuals from the French colonies, to be a voyager was high price for many people, right? And they knew that if they somehow grew to be over 5 feet, 5 inches, or 6 inches, they might be excluded from being a voyager. There was no space in the canoes for tall people. So you had to be more on the shorter side to be part of this profession, which was highly in demand for many individuals, especially the individuals who had been born and had grown in the North America region. Now we look at that defeat in 1759, 1760 of the French in Quebec, and from the company's perspective, they sort of saw this as a positive. Even though the company has this monopoly, this charter that supposedly grants it protection, they were still had to contend with French traders. And the French traders had been trading furs long before the Hudson Bay Company arrived. And they continued trading furs even after the company took and built forts around the bay. The logistics of the Hudson Bay Company were, of course, more advantageous, just being able to sail the furs out of the bay compared to the fur traders in the French colonies who had to perhaps canoe deep into the country and then bring them back into either Quebec or Montreal and then put them on ships back to France. But from the company's perspective, they really thought, hey, the British defeated the French. The French are departing their colonies here in North America, so we should no longer have competitors, which is kind of what we want. We want to have this true monopoly. The Hudson Bay Company was wrong. In 1779, traders from Montreal, they officially became organized into an enterprise called the Northwest Company. This will be colloquially known as the Nor'Westers, which is the name I would use. And the differences between the Nor'Westers and the Hudson Bay Company would be quite stark. and it's going to have some serious implications for our story and just consequences for the birth of two countries, Canada and the US, which is kind of what we're driving to. Now, the companies of the Hudson, the employees of the Hudson Bay Company could really be seen as passive branch managers, for this distant shareholders back in London. They would send their reports back and they await instructions from the London committee. And there was a sort of disconnect between the shareholders and the people who were on the ground. The Nor'westers, on the other hand, were a loose affiliation of individuals who got to share in the profits. They were dynamic, they were entrepreneurial, they were not bound by tradition, and they just really wanted to make the most of the economic opportunity they saw, right? They felt there was unmet demand for trading outposts deeper in the country, and they felt they could create a more elaborate logistic route for furs to sail out of North America. And it would do all this without having to wait for approval from some committee back in London. Now, the Nor'westers were correct in their assessment of the opportunity. The profits that were being dispensed to the partners in the Nor'westers were quite large, right? And it really seems that by the end of the century, this is by the end of the 1700s, many of the Nor'west partners were actually living like princes in their sort of Montreal mansions. The company, on the other hand, it kept dividends low. It built a strategic commercial reserve, a working capital, and they were highly conservative with their finances, and they were sort of thinking of the long term, not just what's going to happen next year, but are we able to survive 10, 20, 30 years of hardship? Versus the Nor'westers, which, it was those individuals, let's make money, let's split the profit among us, we don't have to share it with some distant committee, and that's going to be attractive for the people who want to join us. Now, there are other things going on that are going to affect the relationship between the Nor'westers and the Hudson Bay Company. Britain is going to be engaged in really near continuous wars during this point in time, right? There's the American War of Independence between 1775 and 1783. There's the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815. And all of this are going to deprive the Hudson Bay Company of easy access to young male workers who may be distributed somewhere else to perhaps fight some of the many wars that Britain is now engaged in. On the other hand, the Nor'westers are able to pull in from these growing cities of both Quebec and Montreal, which have very similar culture to the Nor'westers, right? They're also French Canadians, actually, more specifically. They many of them actually were born and had grown in this French colonies or French settlements today, since French no longer considers them colonies. And the difference in employees is going to be quite large. By the beginning of the 1800s, the Hudson Bay Company still had perhaps just a little under 500 employees on the ground in North America, near around the bay. But the Nor'westers, on the other hand, had about 1,200 employees along their increasingly vast supply line as they grow deeper inland to get the furs. So this competition between the Nor'westers and the Hudson Bay Company is going to forever alter the culture of the Hudson Bay. We know that the Hudson Bay Company had this almost like strategy of harmony for its first 100, 150 years, primarily protected by a monopoly, or at least protected by a monopoly plus some geographical advantages, and the fact that the supply of beavers is still quite high during this first 100 years, 150 years. But now with the Nor'westers, and now with a group of individuals who are highly motivated, especially by the possibility of making money, which is going to attract even more people, the Hudson Bay Company has to change. It will need to adapt the strategy. It will need to join the chaos that will be brought forth by the Nor'westers. And this is going to lead to a change in culture at the Hudson Bay Company, which is going to set in motion many of the things we're going to see in our sort of second half of the story here. So let's look at how the culture changed in the Hudson Bay Company as it tried to fend off the Nor'westers. Now, the structure of the Hudson Bay Company did mean that there was some boundaries and constraints to what could actually happen. We saw the Hudson Bay Company, of course, prevent employees from going inland, from becoming embroiled in any existing disagreements between the First Nations tribes. But for the Nor'westers, their more individual-based culture meant that if something was profitable, some individual will probably do it. They'll probably find a way to do it. This was both good and bad. Some of the Northwesters would then adopt even a more deeper understanding of local customs, but it would also lead to some negative consequences. Some reports during this time, right, that they felt that some of the Northwest individuals would act more like some kind of mafia, trying to extract protection and furs from different tribes rather than commercial agents. So we're going to see more violence coming from the Northwesters. And some of the reputation that the Northwesters would have would be quite negative, right? They would go in and they felt that if they could do something to get more furs or to get a better price for furs, they would do it. And because, again, it's highly individualized, you could have perhaps a few bad individuals, bad apples, so to speak, who might taint the entire reputation. Nonetheless, this individualized approach from the Northwesters, highly driven by profit, means that some of the relationship between the Northwestern individuals and the First Nations is going to start to break down. And this is going to be one of the first stark differences between the Northwesters and the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company trying to maintain this long-term view, this view of harmony, this view of, maybe this one season, we're not going to make as much money, but if we think 10, 20, 30 years in the future, we can build relationships and we can have a very successful business. That's kind of going out the window with the Northwesters because they're saying, hey, this season, this single trip, we're going to make as much money as possible. What does that mean? So the Northwesters were making enormous profits. There's no denying that. They were capturing a majority of the fur trade very quickly just by going inland and just being much more aggressive. But besides the increasingly poor relationships with the First Nations, they're also starting to see what happens when you overhunt the beavers. They would go into a new region, and then perhaps the region will eventually become beaver out. That is, the beavers would become extinct in that region. So now the Northwesterns need to go even deeper inland and deeper and deeper. And of course, you can imagine that this pattern is going to repeat over and over again. Now, as the 1800s progress, violence, threats, intimidation quickly become a very viable commercial strategy. You can kind of see this play out in almost like a game theory manner where if some individuals within the Northwesters use violence and it works for them, eventually other individuals will adopt the same things because they don't want to be left behind and because this is a highly sort of competitive environment the Northwesters have built among themselves. So the things that work, even if those things may be morally wrong, are going to become quickly adapted by the Northwesters. And actually, even the Hudson Bay Company is going to have to adopt many things that perhaps in the previous 150 years would have been unthinkable. The companies themselves are going to fight each other. The companies would ambush and shoot at each other along the sort of the main canoe routes. They would attack each other's forts. They would plunder the trade goods and annual fur shipments. And they would sort of move artillery around their forts and try to control key rivers. So not only are the relationship between the First Nations and the fur traders, particularly the Northwesters, starting to deteriorate, there's a war that's starting between the Northwesters and the Hudson Bay Company employees as they try to maintain control of different rivers and different trade routes. We're also going to see the introduction of alcohol become a much more prominent part of the fur trade. Now, alcohol was available. The Hudson Bay Company did use it, especially during the gift-giving ceremonies that they used to have. So it wasn't completely new to the region, but from the perspective of the Northwesters, from their strategy of chaos and trying to maximize profits, all of a sudden alcohol became much more appealing and a much more valuable bargaining chip for individuals in the Northwest Company. And eventually, of course, the Hudson Bay Company will do the same. In the 1800s, it's going to kind of peddle its own variation of brandy and rum. And it would use alcohol to entice many of the First Nations to trade furs with them. Now, I mentioned this just because alcohol is going to also wreak havoc on many of the communities of the First Nations. It is going to cause rates of addiction to go up and many of the negative effects that we see today with any kind of substance. And this is going to become amplified because it's going to be seen as part of a valid tactic in the strategy to trade furs. Now, both companies actually would try to dilute the alcohol. Again, you can see it, right? There's no regulation here. So individuals and both companies would try to perhaps make their liquor not as strong. And this led to suspicion by many of the individuals who were receiving the alcohol, the First Nations. And one of the techniques they used to kind of gauge the strength of the alcohol was to flick or spit a small quantity into a fire. And this is actually the origin of the term fire water. So free liquor is going to soon become an expectation, and it will no longer just be restricted to special occasions or ceremonies like the gift given. It's going to just become part of all fur trading at all points in time. And really, liquor is going to become one of the twin forces that's going to disintegrate many of this existing societies, right? Societies that had been around for hundreds and thousands of years, disease being the other one. And I would even argue that perhaps there's a third element of just the change in traditions. Now that we're about 200 years in after first contact, some of the First Nations had simply changed their traditions. Maybe instead of hunting for fish, now they have become specialized in hunting beavers because they want to get the furs, and then they're going to trade those furs for metal goods. But the traditions that were perhaps originally built around fishing are starting to disappear and being lost as different generations go on. Now, from the perspective of the Hudson Bay Company, they had always believed, and this kind of may seem kind of obvious, that waging war against your clients and customers is never a solid long-term business strategy. But from the perspective of the Northwesters, it could be completely viable, right? Because they're trying to gain control, and if they have to use intimidation or violence or wage war against the literal customers of their fur trade, it completely makes sense. So this is kind of the situation that's now taking place between the Northwesters and the Hudson Bay Company. What became a harmonious relationship between fur traders and the First Nations is now highly chaotic and highly varied. And of course, between the companies themselves, there's also war going on, which is disrupting the fur trade. So this is the situation that we're in as we're in the early 1800s. And we're going to see what's going to happen. Both companies are going to merge by force, not by choice. And we're going to see a new Hudson Bay Company emerge from that merge. Now, before we look at the merge, though, we have to look a little bit at this unspoken race that was going on at the time, which is a race to the Pacific. And this is just really different explorers, not perhaps connected to the fur trade, but just different Europeans who were highly interested in trying to reach the Pacific from the East Coast. Now, let's look at perhaps one of the most well-known Europeans, which is Alexander Mackenzie, and his journey to the Pacific. In 1793, Alexander Mackenzie, well, really Sir Alexander Mackenzie, is going to reach the Pacific from the East Coast. And Mackenzie's journey, first to the Arctic Ocean and then to the Pacific, would forever change the understanding of the continent by giving it boundaries on this previously unknown huge domain. Now, Mackenzie, like other explorers, did not do this on his own, right? He had First Nations guides who took him throughout the journey, usually different guides. Not every guide could know the entire route, so he would change guides as he went along. He would, of course, have to trade during the route to be able to have enough supplies of food and everything to make it. And Mackenzie is going to write a very popular book that's going to become quite influential for several people about his journey. So as he's going on this journey, he's making detailed notes. He's taking measurements, whether astronomical or just geographical, and he's creating a map, effectively, of the places he's reaching, that he's seeing, and of course, he's hearing about in the many conversations he's having across his journey. And it's helpful to think about this map, because I think this was a point that really stood out to me from researching this podcast. Stephen Bound, who wrote this fantastic book called The Company, he said, quote, "To map something is to gain an overarching knowledge of how places and people interact that isn't known to anyone other than the mapper." So maps are intriguing. We're surrounded by maps today. We have Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever, and our maps go down to the street level, and in some cases we have even maps of buildings, so we know exactly what it looks like. So maps may seem quite commonplace, but we have to imagine that at this point in time, despite all the energy that's being spent by the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwesters in the battle and the war, and of course the British Empire, and we see the American 13 colonies expand westward, the lack of a map kind of means that you're kind of going into the unknown. You don't know where this territory exactly ends. How big is it? We do have European explorers who are arriving from the Pacific itself. Individuals like Captain Cook, who are going to explore, modern day Vancouver Island, modern day Vancouver. But there's still unknowns in between the Pacific coast and the East Coast, the Hudson Bay, let's say. So Alexander Mackenzie creating a map all of a sudden removes the unknowns, and it allows the possibility of certain questions to be asked. As the shape is sort of the interior of the North America continent takes place, it gets created in a map. All of a sudden, the empires who are on the ground, even in a small capacity, like the British Empire, the British Empire only has basically like the Hudson Bay Company employees, only has like a few hundred people on the ground. The Americans are much more numerous. But all of a sudden, once you see the map, you start to say, maybe we can control it. Maybe we should think about putting our borders here and not here. And, the Americans themselves, we're going to see actually Thomas Jefferson is going to read Alexander Mackenzie's book when he's in office as president. And he's going to start to think, what? I think we have to put a bigger effort on our westward expansion, because eventually there's going to be claims on borders, and we need to be ready for those claims. The British Empire itself is going to sort of read Alexander Mackenzie's book and all of a sudden say, what? This country may be more valuable than we thought. We should be thinking about what claims do we have to it. So Alexander Mackenzie's journey, besides being difficult, besides being special in the way that he did it, going by canoe with Indigenous guides, his creation of a map of what this land might look like, all of a sudden kind of grabs the attention of empires, in particular empires who are becoming more interested in defining and clarifying the limitations of their empire. Mackenzie is also one of the first individuals who actually argues this very same point. So again, the people who might be reading Mackenzie's book don't even have to think too hard. Mackenzie argues that perhaps new trade routes and outposts in the west of North America were significant for being able to establish precedent for future empires. He's, of course, thinking primarily of the British Empire. And that this west outpost would also be important for any kind of long-term commercial viability in the fur business. He's, of course, thinking primarily of the Hudson Bay Company. So he started to think about this unknown region as more of a piece on a chessboard. And the individuals in the British Empire in America, of course, we're going to see Spain coming down from the south, and we're going to see Russia with claims in Alaska. The people who are reading this book, they're all sort of thinking, I think he's right. I think we should be thinking about what kind of claims we're going to make on this territory. Mackenzie is also one of the first individuals who is going to start a trend of discussing future borders, future claims on territory, without really considering the First Nations who are currently living in the territory itself. Mackenzie doesn't really give it much thought that the Indigenous individuals might have claims themselves to the territory. And we're going to see this again over and over again. We're going to see this in America. We're going to see this in Spain, Russia, and of course the British Empire. They're going to become highly obsessed with trying to define their own borders of their own colonies, whether that will be Canada for the British Empire or America for its own states, without really thinking like, well, what about the people who are currently living here? What do we do? Do they have ownership? And there's going to be some contradictions that are going to take place as, for example, the British Empire would claim, British law over its portion of North America, but the claims of property are not going to be fully respected, right? After all, like, property might be established by precedent, and from that perspective, shouldn't the Indigenous people have precedent? But nonetheless, these are just contradictions in the way many of the individuals are going to start thinking about it. But the point to be made here is that Mackenzie is really one of the first to raise these questions through his journey, through his book, and through his maps. Now, we're also going to see a little bit of shift from the British Empire here. We know the British Empire is stuck in wars at this point in time, early 1800s. It's really stuck in this tectonic struggle with Napoleon back in France. But there's individuals, especially the individuals who might be thinking about the aristocrats and the London Committee and the individuals who have commercial interest in the region that perhaps some kind of consolidated monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company could help the British Empire make claims against the American expansion that's taking place just down south. So now, from the perspective of the British Empire, now it's no longer just, well, we have this, charter and, some of the people connected to the king will get some benefits, some commercial benefits. Now it's like, well, this is now perhaps highly relevant from our perspective as we try to finalize our empire and maintain income, maintain the money we get to be able to maintain the wars that we find ourselves. In 1803, the British government in London is actually going to give colonial courts in Upper and Lower Canada jurisdiction over activities that occur in the territory west of the Canadas. This is a land that's sort of now being called the British Indian Territory at this point in time. Now, this is also one of the first steps that starts to take place as the British Empire starts to apply its version of British law to the people who live there, who are primarily, let's say, British or French individuals, though now we have a bigger mixed population that's of course growing. And once again, it's for the indigenous people, they're sort of now being put under different kind of law that they have been used to for thousands of years without being consulted so much. So this is going to create many of the difficulties that we're going to see in terms of land ownership, even to today, that it's just the British government applying its own law, often in very wide-ranging ways, just like the charter, right? Here's the charter. It's 40% of the Canadian country. We'll figure it out later. Now, we know that the Hudson Bay Company, for its first 150 years, a certain legal and political authority had never been part of the operations. Perhaps there was some language around establishing forts for the future king, but it was never a priority. There was never even something that the Hudson Bay Companies were thinking about or actively working on. But now it's different. Now that Mackenzie has created a map of North America, now that the Americans are expanding westward energetically, now that you have the Russians coming down north from Alaska and, of course, the Spanish from south, now, all of a sudden, for the British Empire, maybe there is something to be said here about how we're going to assert our own legal and political authority in this vast continent. And as it turns out, for us to do it, we need people on the ground. And the only people on the ground, from the perspective of the British Empire, are the Hudson Bay Company employees. So now we're going to take a company, the Hudson Bay Company employees, who were primarily focused on business, on just simply trading furs in a harmonious fashion. They have now been thrown into a chaotic strategy thanks to the Northwesters and this rapid expansion that's taking place inland. But now the Hudson Bay Company is going to be forced to be part of even larger aspirations. The aspirations of a British Empire who's looking around and saying, I think we need to think about the claims that we have in this territory, and we can establish those claims if we are able to say, or we're able to confirm that we have people on the ground that represent the British Empire. And what do you know? We have the Hudson Bay Company on the ground. They're expanding westward. They're going towards there. So perhaps we can use them as a extension of the British Empire. Now, the Americans are going to arrive at the mouth of the Columbia River first, and that just kind of strengthens their claim to the region. This is going to become sort of the old Oregon, even the kind of modern-day British Columbia region. So the British are seeing this, and this is kind of creating even more desire to get to the Pacific, establish their own fur post, bring the Hudson Bay Company there, and be able to have a much stronger claim against the Americans. So this is where we switch into part 3. And in part 3, we're going to move from a strategy of chaos that we saw between the Northwesters and the Hudson Bay Company into a strategy of conquest, as empires are going to wake up and say, this is much bigger than furs. This is much bigger than just profits. This is our entire identity as an empire. The British Empire, where the sun never sets, or the American Empire, which is sort of going to be driven by manifest destiny at this point. Their destiny to conquer this land for themselves. And the Hudson Bay Company, for better or worse, is going to become a pawn in this game that's now going to be played by empires, not just by individual employees trying to trade furs for metal goods. So the game was going to change a little bit, and it's going to take bigger stakes. It's going to be much more dramatic, and it's going to, I think, accelerate some of the changes we saw with this strategy of chaos that the Northwesters introduced. So whatever harmony might have existed between the Hudson Bay Company and the First Nations is going to disappear as empires get involved, and bigger considerations, at least from the perspective of the empires themselves, are going to take precedent over relationships, over long-term viability of the fur trade, and so forth. So let's move on and see how the strategy of conquest is going to play out for the Hudson Bay Company and for the lives of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals who are currently on the ground. Part 3, a strategy of conquest. So we're going to pick up our story. We're in the early 1800s. We know that Mackenzie, as one of the first Europeans to go from the East Coast to the West Coast to crisscross the country, has written a critical book, has created a map of what was previously an unknown territory. When Charles II created his grandiose charter and gave it to his cousin Prince Rupert, they didn't quite know what was the charter really encompassing. How big was this territory? But now, thanks to Mackenzie and thanks to other explorers who have explored, let's say, from the Pacific inland, there's a pretty clear understanding as to how big North America really is. And now that race to the Pacific, it's really picking up in earnest. It's not just individuals like Mackenzie, but now the British Empire, America, and related entities are trying to figure out their claims to this territory. We left the Hudson Bay Company in this fierce battle with the Northwesters. We know that the Northwesters, as a more entrepreneurial, more dynamic organization, were quickly capturing the majority of the profits from the fur trade. They had less morals. I think we can say that objectively. And these two companies have been going to battle now for many years, and it has not been good for business. You can imagine the constant skirmishes, shooting at each other, trying to keep control of rivers. It just has not really been good for business. But yet, the Hudson Bay Company had to engage in this. They had to go inland. They had to leave their comfortable monopoly by the bay to be able to actually have even a fighting chance against the Northwesters. Now, the costs of this conflict, and it's about 7 years, are really staggering. Both parties are crushed under the weight of debt. Remember, the Hudson Bay had been historically conservative. They had paid dividends, but typically they were careful not to pay too much because they were trying to keep the company in a strong cash position for 5, 10, 20 years. The Northwesters, on the other hand, were highly focused on profit. The partners and the individuals would get paid right away. So the company just did not have a comfortable financial position to engage in a battle like this. Now, the Hudson Bay Company, it owed about £100,000 to the Bank of England and other creditors, but it still had well-placed political advocates, right? The London Committee, the aristocrats who were part of the small group of shareholders, they were still well-connected in the Bank of England. There was not really a major risk that somehow the Hudson Bay Company will run out of money, but debts are accumulating, and this is not good for business. The Northwesters, or the Northwest Company, as we might know it, was significantly more vulnerable. Its business model really involved paying extravagant yearly dividends to its shareholders, who were also the managers. And of course, this left little capital to finance any kind of long-term goals. Now, the Northwest Company was financing itself through an individual called Lord Selkirk. He's part of the story, though it doesn't really get covered in our episode. But he was a rich aristocrat, we might call that. And he was sort of personally funding the Northwesters. Of course, the Northwesters had money from their own trade. But generally, this was not enough money. It definitely did not compare to having access to the Bank of England, for example, right? And the Lord Selkirk, he was paying about £50,000 a year. And the Northwest Company still had to sort of skimp on paying some of its partners. And of course, the individuals who did the actual trading and traveling. Both companies were also seeing a decline in trade. This, in a way, sort of made sense, right? We were seeing how region after region was being beaver out as both the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company moved into that. So the high abundance of beavers that was available when the Hudson Bay Company was created in 1670, it's of course becoming ever more difficult to find beavers. You have to go more inland. So generally, conditions are not good in the fur trade business, and of course, it's being made worse by this fierce competition. And so, in the spring of 1821, the British Empire, or at least the rich aristocrats who had connections to the crown and the monarchy, they made it known that they would like companies to be merged. So both the head managers and the shareholders got notice that it was now of interest to the British Empire if both companies, the Hudson Bay Company and the Nor'westers, could be merged onto a single company. The board of the new company, the new merged company, would be dominated by former company members, as was the ownership. But many of the Nor'westers' partners did get promoted to positions like chief factors, typically the individuals in charge of critical posts for trading. But the Hudson Bay Company, you can imagine the London Committee and so on, they did maintain significant ownership of the new merged company. Part of the deal in the merge was that this new company, which will retain the name Hudson Bay Company, so the Northwestern name, the Northwest Company name will disappear and just become part of the Hudson Bay Company. Part of the deal for this new and larger Hudson Bay Company would be that the charter in which it operates, the charter that was originally given to in 1670, will now be enlarged. So if one believe that the original charter, which, as you may remember, encompassed about 40% of modern-day Canada, part of South Dakota and Minnesota, then you gotta get ready because a new charter is being issued, and it will be given to the new merged and larger Hudson Bay Company. And so the folks over in Britain, they defined the new charter encompassing anywhere to which a company employee or a Nor'wester had ever traveled in the past 150 years. It would, of course, include the historical Rupert's Land, which was the original land that was given in the first charter. But it will now extend from the Hudson Bay north to the Arctic and west to the Pacific and encompass all the interior parkland. In a way, this new charter of the merged and larger version of the Hudson Bay Company was really Alexander Mackenzie's dream. It would give the British Empire an exclusive imperial trade monopoly that covered really the northern part of North America. Only the two Canadas, the Upper and Lower Canadas, and the Atlantic colonies weren't included in the Dominion. Now, the company's domain after the merger was enormous. It had 7.8 million square kilometers. It was equivalent in size to Western Europe, or about 8% of the Earth's surface. And now we're going to see a Hudson Bay Company that's going to get larger, more efficient, more profitable, actually. Now, we're going to see a Hudson Bay Company that's going to streamline its operations. As you can imagine, if you don't have two entities fighting for the same territory, all of a sudden, profits and operations can be well run. And this new company, this newly merged Hudson Bay Company, will come to dominate the lives of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people, as well as its own employees. And it will eventually have posts as far away as Hawaii, with, of course, its warehouses back in London, and become this central entity for the trade of fur around the world. Around the same time, the British government also passed the Act for Regulating the Fur Trade and establishing a criminal and civil jurisdiction within certain parts of North America, which it's a lengthy name, but it really just established a framework for regulating people's lives in a way never before in the fur territories. We had seen similar laws passed in the Upper and Lower Canada, perhaps in some of the Atlantic colonies, but now this was extended to the rest of the country, really the rest of the Hudson Bay Company charter, which of course was almost all of Canada. And once again, this now establishes a new rule of law over an area that previously did not have a rule of law, not in this manner anyway. The First Nations had their own laws, which they negotiated among themselves. But now we have a third-party entity like the British Empire stamping their own way of doing things. And this is going to lay the groundwork for, of course, the birth of Canada as a nation. But we're starting to see how the Hudson Bay Company went from focusing highly on business, then being forced to compete with the Nor'westers, and now it's being used as an extension of the British Empire to establish legal authority. We're going to see establish more moral authority. And of course, we're going to see the Hudson Bay Company being forced or being a key part of the promotion of very specific cultural values that the British Empire wants to extend over all of its territories and colonies. In this new phase, now with competition fully gone, the Hudson Bay no longer competes against anyone, just itself. There's going to be a new character who's going to enter the scene and is going to take the Hudson Bay Company to new heights. And objectively speaking, is going to make the company be perhaps as successful as it will ever be before it starts to decline again. And this person goes by the name of George Simpson. And George Simpson will represent the confirmation of this shift that we have been seeing in the Hudson Bay Company ever from the sleepy monopoly by the bay, the strategy of harmony that we saw in the first part, shifting away from that into the strategy of chaos. And now George Simpson will fully internalize the strategy of conquest and mold the Hudson Bay Company in his image. George Simpson. Now, George was born in a small town called Dingwall in Scotland, and he grew up in a competitive environment. He would grow to be a combative young man. He was highly ambitious. It seems that many of his teachers actually introduced him to geography, and he had a fascination with maps from a very early age. I mention this because, of course, we saw how important maps can be after Mackenzie created a map of the North America territories. And even from a young age, he seemed to be highly interested in the commerce between Scotland and England and the rest of the world, and how maps sort of seem to show all of that. In his early 20s, Simpson would move to London, and he would go work for his uncle, Geddes, who was a partner in one of the 40 London brokerages that handled the most valuable of all imports at this point in time, and that import was sugar. Now, throughout the 18th century, there was a rumor that there was really more money in this very small plot of old London where all of these 40 London brokerages exist than even in the vaults of King George himself. And the sugar trade was highly profitable. It was just a huge moneymaker for everyone involved. In particular, this London offices that did the trading of sugar itself. So Uncle Geddes would take on his nephew, George, and help him learn the ropes of what this sugar trade business looks like. He would actually become a future son-in-law for Uncle Geddes. Nonetheless, we have to understand that the sugar at this point in time was really the king of commodities. In the 300 years since European contact in North America, sugar turned from just being a condiment used by nobility and royalty to something that almost everyone could access to and could buy. Sugar, of course, by this point in time was planted in the West Indies. This is the modern-day Caribbean, so some of the islands like Cuba and Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. African slaves were used in this trade, and this is going to become important. And the demand for sugar was just simply insatiable among the Brits. And again, not just the nobility, but really all Brits. Sugar was being converted to molasses for cooking. There was granular sugar in tea and coffee, fermented sugar, things like rum, and like gin, which became, almost like a group food on itself. So sugar was just this incredibly profitable and well-established business. And George Simpson, through his uncle, learned it. And he learned what it took to run a proper business, that is just the ins and outs of business. The accounting, the record keeping, the insurance, the office management. He understood the seasonality and the production rhythms of sugar itself, the different trade routes that existed in the Atlantic, the difficulties with the West Indian weather, and of course, the difficulties of what it meant to maintain a slave force. He learned about markets, pricing, exchange strategies, cash flow, leveraging, customer relations, the micro and the macro of business administration. And it became clear that George really had a knack for a lot of these things. His expertise that he will bring to the Hudson Bay Company were really around operations and logistics. Today, we might say that he is a fantastic sort of operations manager, the kind of person who can understand a supply chain from start to end and understand that at a macro level, and then to be able to dig deep into the details of that supply chain. And this is, objectively speaking, we have to say it, this is just a gift that George had. And he's going to apply this to the Hudson Bay Company in a way that no one had ever applied this before, right? Remember that the Hudson Bay Company, before the merger, was sort of this operation that was run by people on the ground, but a lot of the rules were made by the London Committee, and it all kind of made sense. It was profitable, but there was never really a single person who seemed to really drive the business forward. The Nor'westers were a bunch of entrepreneurial individuals who seemed to just go after whatever the most profitable thing was. And of course, by the time these two companies compete, they're really kind of killing each other and killing whatever profits. So George Simpson, can't be argued, is really the first individual who's going to come in and apply a systematic and smart way of managing the company. Now, he's a difficult individual, perhaps, to talk about, and we'll see why in a second. But I just want to lay the ground that his background in the sugar trade with his uncle taught him a lot of this fundamental skills around managing a business, and it was clearly he had a talent, a knack for it. Now, young Simpson, during his time with his uncle, he made several trips to the West Indies, and it's clear that he absorbed many of the notions of superiority based upon skin culture and culture that was highly common in the West Indies. From his time, spending time in these islands and spending time with the slaves themselves, you got to remember that in some islands, you look at some islands like Jamaica, for example, modern Jamaica, the split between the slaves and the non-slaves was quite drastic. You might have a population where perhaps 80, 90% of the people who live in the island are slaves and the other 10% are not. And the slave trade that made the West Indies possible was, of course, quite brutal. We talk about sort of this middle passage from Africa to the West Indies, where a significant portion of the slaves themselves might die. The conditions on the ground were just terrible. If you think about the terrible stories about slavery and how the owners would punish people and they would whip people and they would come up with all kinds of punishments when slaves step out of line, this is exactly what you have in the West Indies. So it's a highly exploitative, highly difficult situation that's taking place in the West Indies. And this is where young Simpson is visiting. This is the kind of trade he's learning first in London. And then he gets to do a few trips himself and kind of see it for himself. And it just seems to confirm certain beliefs that he has in his mind. Simpson also seemed to enjoy the power that came from here, that feeling of being superior. And we're going to see this over and over again in the policies that he's going to implement within the Hudson Bay Company. So his time in the sugar trade is important to understand, just because the views that George is going to bring into the Hudson Bay Company are really quite different from what existed, right? You remember the strategy of harmony that the Hudson Bay had for its first 100, 120 years was really about how do we respect the existing traditions of the First Nations? How do we become part of it? If we have to get married, we're going to do that. If we have to do the gift giving, we're going to do that. The Northwesters started to introduce a more violent way of dealing with the First Nations. And then, of course, we're going to see individuals like Alex and Mackenzie who are going to introduce some of these notions that perhaps the British should have a right to this land, and the individuals themselves, the Indigenous nations, do not have the same rights. But George Simpson is really going to make all of this concrete. He's going to see that in the West Indies, he's going to accept it, and he's going to bring it into North America. So all of that he sees in the West Indies, this becomes just part of who he is and what he believes and how he believes the company should be run. And while he may not equate the First Nations to slaves down in the West Indies, it is clear that he had his own sort of hierarchy for how he thought about individuals. And then based on the hierarchy, then individuals had certain rights or demands that could be valid and others that could not. So his time in the sugar trade is just critical. You have someone who grew up in a completely different environment from many of the people who had worked in the Hudson Bay Company, even many of the Nor'westers who had themselves perhaps been born and grown in North America. They had been surrounded by First Nation culture since a very young age, and perhaps they had some ideas about what it meant to be European versus not. But George Simpson is fully bringing that in. George Simpson is coming in and saying, I'm from, I spent time in the West Indies, and it is clear that we as the British or the Europeans, we are the superior ones, which is why sort of slavery and all this stuff kind of makes sense. And thus, this is kind of the operating belief system I'm going to implement in the Hudson Bay Company. Now, George Simpson arrives in North America about 1820, 1821. He takes on the position as sort of the general manager of the company. He was surprised to hear, actually, that the Northwesters and the Hudson Bay Company had been merged. He had been hoping that he would defeat the Northwesters in battle. So that can tell you maybe a little bit about his personality. He's a little disappointed that he's not going to get to defeat this Northwesters at their own game. Instead, he's going to have to work with them. But, the merge is out of his hands. It's already done by the time he sort of takes over the Hudson Bay Company. And now he's being given this even larger company with an even larger charter. So from his perspective, this may be pretty good after all. It is intriguing to know, right, that he sort of gave up his comfortable life in London to come to North America. Even perhaps in the city hubs, like perhaps like Montreal and Quebec, the life was likely not as comfortable as it would have been back in London. And George Simpson, despite his flaws, he's not going to be a detached manager. He's going to spend a lot of time in a different fort. He's going to spend a lot of time in canoes and out in the territories. And he seemed to gladly give up the comforts of modernity to run this company. It just seems like the power that he got from running this huge enterprise was just so alluring that it was worth it, to give everything that he had known up to this point in London. One of his first orders of business was to streamline the forts. By the point he took over, there were 97 Northwest Company forts and 76 that belonged to the Hudson Bay Company, and many of them were actually within sort of hailing distance of each other. You can imagine them in the same river, and one was on one side and the other was on the other side. So obviously from a efficiency perspective, this doesn't make any sense. So now the companies merge. He's going to start to close a lot of these duplicate efforts to try to improve profits from the fur trade, to kind of bring back the company back into a good financial position and learn how to run this business well. He will reduce the number of employees from about 2,000 when the companies merge to just over 700 after a few years, though this number is going to actually increase in during his time. So again, just a huge level of streamlining that George Simpson's going to start to do. He actually picks up a canoe. Now, he's not going to paddle himself. He's going to have a team, First Nations, typically Iroquois, who are going to be his sort of paddling team and take him anywhere he wants to go. And this canoe, which we might even call like an executive canoe, you can kind of think about it as the modern-day private jet, for an executive. George Simpson is going to gladly get on this canoe and visit every single fort, every single important position for the company over his many years. And he's often going to do hundreds of miles every day, traveling, moving from fort to fort. Typically, he liked to appear at forts without any notice so he can see how the fort is actually running and, of course, give improvements or feedback. He would go on to set speed records on pretty much every canoe and boat route in the country, and he never really stayed in one place for long. Now, again, he was never doing any of the paddling himself. He was just getting on the canoe, and it seems like the motion of the rowing was quite relaxing. He would just fall asleep, take a nap, and then whenever they arrive at the next location, he would go on to do his business, whatever that is, get back on the canoe, and the team continues on. The team that paddles, of course, might paddle for 12 hours a day, maybe take a few breaks when possible, and then keep going on. But he was a devious man, might be the way to describe it. He just simply couldn't help himself to have some quirky things in the way he managed his employees. It is said that sometimes he would actually fall asleep in the canoe, and he would let one of his arms dangle to the side of the canoe and sort of dangle into the water itself. And that was his way of being able to gauge the speed of the canoe. So if the canoe slowed down more than he thought it should, he would be able to just wake up and actually, give orders to speed up. So even in his sleep, he was sort of trying to control the individuals who are trying to row him from location to location. And he was really an emperor in this area, right? I mean, we have to remember, even after the merge, it meant that the London Committee, who now manages this even larger Hudson Bay Company, is still detached. they're not coming in to visit North America and see what's going on. George Simpson is now their key person on the ground. So from the perspective of the hundreds of thousands of individuals who are under the company's domain, whether as actual employees, which is a small amount, somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000, but the other individuals who are trading with the company on a regular basis, he is the emperor of this area, right? He is the ruler of every social and business situation within the domain of the Hudson Bay Company. We can even say, he was really the boss of the only general store for half a continent. Now, his sort of devious schemes continue. Another thing that he would do is he would actually pressure the laborers and the officers to renew the contracts during the winter, because for the individuals who were on the ground in North America, they had no idea what the prevailing rates were back in London, and they usually tended to agree to less without knowing the full details of what the rates were. He, of course, started to limit the positions by which native-born people, whether indigenous or of the mixed heritage, who, again, by this point in time, we're 1820s, there's now a significant number of them who had been part of the families of the Hudson Bay Company employees for a couple hundred years. So these individuals were now being prevented from rising up the ranks within the company. And he preferred to import managers from London or from Europe. So we start to see some of these racist ideas that he took on back in the West Indies. He's now going to start to apply them to an organization where they really did not exist, nowhere nearly the same level that perhaps he had seen them in the sugar trade. And by the 1860s, the so-called sort of mixed heritage half-breeds, as he sometimes called them, would only make up about a third of the officer ranks. Now, he viewed the indigenous people as really he did animals in his domain, not really independent masters of their own destiny, but just somehow tied to the company. And they were just sort of pieces in the chessboard to be moved around as he saw fit. He actually even tried to get rid of the gift-giving ceremonies that we saw be crucial since the very beginning. But he completely underestimated the entrenched value of this ceremony. And he was only able to tweak the exchange towards less valuable items such as tea, sugar, or tobacco, instead of firearms, knives, and kettles. So even something like the gift-giving ceremony, right, which the initial Hudson Bay companies saw it, they realized how important it was, and they adopted it. George Simpson sees it, and he's like, you know what? This seems a little inefficient. We don't really need to give such highly valuable items for this first. We're going to try to get rid of it and tweak it, but that sort of backfire. Now, his success was really his uncanny understanding of logistics. He really was able to grasp the entire seasonal movement of people and goods, how the directional flow of the rivers affected the trade, how to get supplies where they were needed in the exact quantities needed, how to get the maximum quantity out of furs and sort of give out the less amount of valuable goods. So to him, this massive continent of North America, modern-day Canada, was not just some sort of series of immutable barriers, but just this collection of situations that could be solved with the right ideas. And the fur trade became this giant game board where all the forts and individuals and the voyagers and the indigenous people could be moved around every year for the maximum advantage. So that's really his superpower. His understanding of logistics and being able to implement that logistics in some ways ruthlessly, was his ability to make the Hudson Bay as profitable as it did during this era. Now, the final point to know about Simpson is he had many wives, or at least many mistresses, perhaps might be the better term. It is said that he had about 13 children with 8 different women, to possibly more. And his beliefs around that tended to be represented very heavily by what he saw in the sugar trade. He typically had relationships with indigenous women, and once he felt that relationship had run its course, he would get rid of them and move on to the next one. Eventually, he would find a wife that he felt was appropriate for his social status in the Canadas and in the colonies. But it was clear that his approach to relationships and even children represented a lot of his beliefs around, the mixed heritage, the mixed breeds that he saw around him. And he really just didn't want much more to do with them besides that. Now, while George Simpson has taken on the Hudson Bay Company. He's going to run it for the next 40 years. And he's going to do a fantastic job from a business perspective. From a perspective of business and profits, he's going to kill it. From the perspective of the culture of the company is clearly going to change. He's going to represent more of that sugar trade, West Indie beliefs. But while all that's going on, the empires themselves are also making their own moves. They're also starting to determine their borders. And these are things that are going to, in some ways, help George Simpson, and in other ways, hurt him a little bit. So let's look at how the Clash of Empires is going to settle over this time period in the mid-1800s. Now, we know there were 4 empires within the region. We have the British, of course. We have America, now independent. We have the Spanish coming up from the south. And we have Russia with a claim to Alaska and coming up from the north. Now, throughout this period, basically from about 1819 onwards, we saw in 1818, of course, the U.S. and Britain agree on this joint ownership of the western region. There were no specific borders. There was actually an idea that was surfaced in this negotiation that perhaps the line between America and Britain should be the 49th parallel, which is what it is today. But there was not enough agreement to make this permanent. So now there's this weird, ambiguous relationship between the British and America around the Oregon region and today's British Columbia. In 1819, the U.S. and Spain is going to sign the Adams-Onis Treaty. Spain will agree to sell Florida for $5 million. And Spain is also going to agree to the northern boundary of California being set at the 42nd parallel, and then cede any rights to the territories north of that to the United States. Russia, in 2 separate treaties, one with the U.S. in 1824 and another with Britain in 1825, is going to leave the old Oregon region. And they're going to agree to a southern boundary for Alaska, roughly similar to what the Canadian-American border has today. In 1827, both the British and the U.S. are going to agree to make those 1818 terms indefinite. So they're not going to solve them, but they're going to agree that this ambiguous relationship is fine until the near future. Now, George Simpson, of course, was seeing all this going on. He joined the Hudson Bay Company in 1821. And he believed that 49th parallel division that was first suggested in the 1818 negotiation would actually probably be the final border. So he decided to put his efforts north of the 49th parallel, specifically looking at the Fraser River, which is today in British Columbia. And he believed that this is where the Hudson Bay Company should really focus their forts and build logistics and all that. There were some people within the company that were actually quite against this. They had a lot of work and hopes that the actual line would be lower, go down all the way to modern-day Oregon. But George Simpson didn't think that would be possible. It seemed like the old Oregon region was quickly becoming highly Americanized. That is, there were a lot of Americans flowing into the region. And the 49th parallel seemed much more practical for the British. Now, the Americans are, of course, extending westward during all this time. President James Monroe gave an address to Congress in 1823, and he talked about what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine, which simply stated that any foreign intervention in the affairs of the Americas, including the emerging states in South America, would be viewed as an assault of the U.S. So the U.S. is starting to establish themselves as a distinct empire from the British and from Spain, and an empire that's willing to fight for its borders and its claims to the land that they see as their own destiny, right? This is the era of manifest destiny, which is a belief among many people in the American government that the continent of what would become America today was allotted to them by Providence, and it was their right to take it and make their own claims on it. Now, again, just like in Canada, the specific rights of perhaps the Indigenous nations themselves within the American continent did not play such a big role. There were aspects to try and make some of these claims stronger, or perhaps give land to the Indigenous people as the U.S. government took over specific areas for themselves. But this wasn't as perfect, and there's still obviously claims that still are outstanding even today. Now, the only presence the company had in the territory of North America, modern-day Canada, was really the Hudson Bay Company, right? So George Simpson is now seeing himself not just as this local emperor that's dominating the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, but as the individual who can help the British Empire solidify their claims to this massive piece of land. So in 1846, the British and the Americans come back to the table and they decide to relook at the decision as to what should be the actual border between them. And they agree, as many expected, including George Simpson, that the 49th parallel east of the Rocky Mountains should be the dividing line between America and the British Empire. Now, the British counter that the 49th parallel was reasonable. However, all of what today is Vancouver Island should remain British. If you actually look at the map today, you'll see that the 49th parallel actually dips a little bit to go around Vancouver Island. It doesn't just cut the island in half. They thought cutting the other island in half did not make much sense. So the Americans were fine with that as well. So the border today runs through the Juan de Fuca Strait and out into the sea. All of the company's property would be legally recognized, and the Columbia River would not be close to the company's ships for the duration of the fur trade. The last company fort would actually shut its gates around 1871. And now we're getting to the end of our story here. During this time, the Hudson Bay Company had a bigger focus on colonization, but really they sort of pursue this somewhat half-heartedly. George Simpson likely made several choices that would help the British with their claims, but we have to understand that some of the colonization aims that the British Empire had, whether it's the promotion of religion, of Christianity, or the cultural values, would sometimes be the same thing as trying to go at war with your own customers. And the fur trade was trying to balance the need to have profits, just business, while trying to balance the needs of a British Empire to align themselves to be more of an actual colony for it. So the Hudson Bay was involved in some of these things, but again, there was always a philosophical conflict for the company employees. The Pacific Coast would, of course, be defined very heavily by the battles between the British Empire and the American Empire as they were trying to find their borders. This hybrid of a fur trade and a crown colony was defined mainly in sort of anti-American terms, and British Columbia today was created and took shape largely as a reaction to the U.S. encroachment down south. The world is also changing. By the time we get to the mid-1800s, railroads are becoming much more common in the region. We actually saw the role of railroads in the Sears episode number 1 of this podcast. But railroads also means that some of the things that George Simpson was doing when he first joined the Hudson Bay Company, like canoeing for 150 kilometers a day, was no longer necessary. When Simpson did his round-the-world voyage, all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast and then back, he did this in 1841. And despite being able to set speed records, or that is his rowers, his voyagers set speed records, it took him 38 days to do this round-the-world voyage. And after 1854, this could be done in 10, primarily because of railroads. As time goes on, too, as we get to the mid-1800s, it started to become a little absurd to everyone that a single company can have control or dominance over half a continent. And there was really starting to be more complaints that somehow civilization, and we're talking here about British civilization in particular, should be excluded from half a continent for the benefit of about 232 shareholders, which was the number of individuals who owned the Hudson Bay Company. And I think the best place to end our story today is actually in 1860. This is when George Simpson passes away. When he actually drafted his last will, just to show you his sort of more devious beliefs that he got from the sugar trade, he excluded from his vast estate all of his numerous children with Indigenous mothers, of course, right? He didn't want any of them to have any claim to his money. But he even actually instructed his executor to assess the appropriateness of any suitors of his quote-unquote legitimate daughters. This is the daughters he had with perhaps non-Indigenous women. And if they not pass the necessary appropriateness, whatever that was, the executor should withhold their portions and simply give it to someone else. So even in his death, George Simpson is trying to ensure that his beliefs around superiority and race are being followed down to the line. Now, in 1869, the Hudson Bay Company will agree to surrender its land rights to the British Crown, which would then transfer it to the new nation of Canada. Now, the company is going to receive about $300,000 in compensation far less than the directors had hoped for. But it would get to retain its numerous forts and factories and, of course, the land surrounding them. They actually also got a 5% ownership of the territory of the Southern Fertile Belt. This is some of the prairies area of today. And in 1870, about a year later, then the remaining territory of the Hudson Bay Company would become part of the new country of Canada. And the company would then need to float as more of a regular business. And its monopoly would eventually be removed altogether. Now we have to remember that the fur trade itself will, of course, decline through the 1800s into the 1900s. So the company would change. Today, the Hudson Bay Company still exists. They have retail stores. They, of course, sell all kinds of items, not just furs. So the company, of course, will go on to change even more in the 1900s into the 2000s. And I love this quote, again, from Stephen Bound, who wrote The Company. And he said, quote, "The company was merely a vessel for the dreams, aspirations, hopes, and ambitions of the thousands of men and women whose contributions animated for 2 centuries, in the process transforming a continent. The company was nothing other than its people and their stories. Everything else is now dust, and we live in their world, just as they live in ours." And with this, we're coming to the end of our story, a story that was marked by a strategy of harmony, a strategy of chaos, and of course, a strategy of conquest. A story where we had several individuals, several strands of history from different perspectives, built around the fur trade. The Hudson Bay Company, whether they wanted it or not, they shaped North America. Their forts, their presence, was really the main claim the British had to what became Canada. That same presence likely played a role in America not simply taking up that part of the continent, as it seemed like it just made sense in their manifest destiny belief. So the individuals who joined the Hudson Bay Company, who lived on the ground, who traded furs, perhaps didn't quite know that they were part of a much bigger game, that they were a part of a much bigger conversation. But that's what it ended up being for them. Today, we live in a world where the borders of Canada, of the US, represent limitations on where we can go. And every time we cross a border, we can think of the Hudson Bay Company as their seemingly simple desire to trade furs for metal goods played a massive role in the creation of 2 countries. And of course, those 2 countries then play an even bigger role in the rest of the world and other countries. So I want to thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you were able to gain some insights from the story of the Hudson Bay Company. One final thing before you go. My name is Ruben Ugarte. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Stratagems. This is the 5th episode of the podcast. It's been a fantastic journey to make this podcast this year, 2024. This will be the last episode for the year, though I am planning more episodes next year, so stay tuned for that. However, there are a few things you could do if you'd like to help the podcast, if you have found this episode or any of the other episodes enjoyable. The first thing is I would love it if you leave a review in the Apple Podcast Store. This will take you 60 seconds. It will help me, it will help the algorithm, and of course, it will help others find the podcast. Second, I would love to hear your comments and questions, so please send me those. You can find my email in the main website of the Stratagems podcast, and just let me know what you think about the podcast. I'm always curious to hear what people are thinking as they go through this episodes. And third, I highly recommend you check out some of the other episodes. The format is similar. The McKinsey episode is fantastic. I think it's one of my favorite episodes so far of the series. The first episode of Sears, I think, is also great. But really all 4 episodes, Sears being number 1, Boeing number 2, Polaroid number 3, and McKinsey number 4. And I have a host of stories I'm looking forward to tackle in the next episodes for next year, which I think will just be really great and really keep building on the themes that we have seen in this first 5 episodes around the role of strategy, how the modern world is shaped by a plethora of decisions, the nuance of history, and how there's not perhaps a single strand that is good or bad. All of these themes we're going to continue diving into in 2025. With that being said, once again, my name is Ruben Ugarte, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.